For decades, Sweden was a role model, a country where equality wasn't just a promise, but a reality. An open society where trust was so high that locks and cameras weren't needed. Where the government worked, the education system was a global example, and social cohesion seemed unbreakable. A country that had solved the biggest problems. But little by little, some things started to break. Today, there are entire neighborhoods where the police won't enter without backup. Daily shootings with automatic weapons. Planted bombs and grenade attacks. Criminal gangs, mostly made up of people from immigrant communities, are the ones setting the rules. Those who can, leave. And what's left are fragments of a country ruled by fear and silence. What began as a multicultural experiment ended up splitting society. A society that now lives between pride in what it once was and fear of what it has become. In this video, we'll explain why the most idealistic country in Europe no longer knows who it is. At the end of the 19th century, Sweden was one of the poorest countries in Northern Europe. Its economy depended on agriculture, but the cold climate and poor soil made farming hard and life difficult. Poverty was so extreme that between 1850 and 1930, 1.3 million Swedes emigrated to the United States, a third of the total population. But that same scarcity created a culture of hard work, discipline, and austerity. And when the industrial age arrived, Sweden knew how to make the most of it. Besides having well-prepared human capital, it had two other strategic advantages: natural resources and geographic location. In the north of the country, there were some of the highest quality iron ore deposits in the world. On top of that, Sweden had vast forests that provided plenty of wood and rivers that generated cheap hydroelectric power. And its access to the Baltic Sea and the North Sea made it a key trade hub for Northern Europe. With that foundation, during the first half of the 20th century, Sweden went from being a marginal agricultural economy to one of the most dynamic industrial powers on the continent. The country invested in technology, technical education, and heavy industries. Large family-run companies emerged, companies that are still Swedish icons today, like Volvo and Saab. But there was another decisive factor in its development. Sweden stayed neutral in both world wars. While the rest of Europe was destroyed, Sweden kept its infrastructure intact, its population alive, and its economy running. At the end of the Second World War, with its industry untouched, its natural resources rich, and a well-prepared population, Sweden became an export powerhouse. By 1975, Sweden had already become the fourth richest country in the world in terms of GDP per capita. But beyond its resources, the true foundation of Sweden's success was its culture. Up until the 1970s, Swedes shared the same ethnicity, language, religion, and a set of social norms that didn't need to be enforced. People followed the rules because everyone believed in them. It was a community of equals, where standing out too much could be frowned upon, but breaking the rules was even worse, because trust was the most valuable thing. And not just trust between people, but something much harder to find in the rest of the world: trust in institutions. Swedes trusted their police, their teachers, and even their politicians. They trusted that their taxes would be well spent and that if they worked hard, the system would give them real opportunities. And for a long time, that was true, with a public education system that not only taught, it also created equality. It made sure that the son of a factory worker and the son of an engineer had the same chances to move up in society. And by doing so, it passed on the values that held up the Swedish model. That sense of community was reinforced outside the classroom too, through strong local, social, and work networks. All of that cultural structure was shaped into one powerful idea that defined Swedish identity for decades: the folkhemmet, or people's home. The vision of a society that worked like a big family where everyone looked out for each other. But like in any family, that solidarity also came with responsibilities: to contribute, to behave, and to respect the shared rules. The Swedish model worked because it was a social contract between people who shared values, rules, and a strong sense of belonging. But all of that began to change in the 1970s when Sweden decided it didn't just want to be an efficient country, it wanted to be a moral example. And that shift in mindset had a name: Olof Palme, a charismatic, idealistic politician who was deeply critical of American imperialism, South African apartheid, and the military dictatorships in Latin America. He served as Sweden's prime minister from 1969 to 1976, and again from 1982 to 1986, when he was assassinated in central Stockholm. In his view, Sweden should become the moral conscience of the West. It wasn't enough to remain neutral. Sweden had to take sides with the weak, the marginalized, and the persecuted around the world. Sweden's actions in support of third world liberation movements would only be credible if it showed the same concern for the problems of its own immigrants. That's why, in 1975, the Swedish parliament approved a fundamental policy document, Guidelines for an Immigrant and Minority Policy. It was a national policy resolution that officially replaced the old assimilation model with a system of institutionalized multiculturalism. The Swedish state would no longer expect immigrants to adapt to the national culture. From that point on, the goal was to guarantee that immigrants could preserve their language, identity, and culture. The policy was based on equal rights for immigrants, the freedom to keep their culture, and peaceful coexistence between communities, without requiring everyone to be the same, just respectful of each other. And this push for multiculturalism wasn't just an idea, it led to very real decisions. Schools began offering mother tongue instruction for the children of immigrants. The government funded cultural and religious associations from foreign communities, created state-run media in different languages, and designed public policies with diverse cultural frameworks. Sweden would be the country that opened its doors when others were closing theirs, without demanding that newcomers adapt. And for decades, Sweden kept that promise with impressive consistency. In the 1970s and 1980s, Sweden received around 25,000 Latin Americans fleeing military dictatorships and around 30,000 Iranians after the Islamic Revolution. Thousands of refugees also arrived from long conflicts in Afghanistan, Eritrea, and Somalia. By the early 1990s, although the numbers were still moderate and only 2% of the population were immigrants, the change was starting to become visible. And the numbers kept rising in the years that followed. Sweden welcomed tens of thousands of refugees from the Balkan Wars, more than 80,000 people from Bosnia alone between 1992 and 1994. By the end of the century, over 1 million people living in Sweden had been born abroad, making up about 11% of the total population. In the 2000s, this trend continued. Year after year, Sweden kept receiving tens of thousands of immigrants and refugees from countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, and nations in the Horn of Africa. By 2010, the country had received almost 1.4 million immigrants, representing 14.3% of the Swedish population. In many urban neighborhoods, native Swedes were already a minority, and segregation, unemployment, and cultural differences were becoming more obvious. The breaking point came in 2015. That year, during the peak of the European migration crisis, Sweden, with just 10 million people, received 163,000 asylum applications in only 12 months, most of them from Syria. It was the highest per capita rate in the entire OECD. Asylum offices were overwhelmed. Local governments had to set up emergency shelters in gyms, hotels, and community centers, and the school and healthcare systems couldn't keep up. By 2024, 20% of the Swedish population were immigrants. This was a massive transformation of the country's demographics in just a few decades. But Sweden's immigration problem isn't just about numbers. It's that Sweden's welcome model is based on the idea that the government can manage integration from the top down, like just another administrative process. Migrants are sent to regions where they don't know anyone, where there are no jobs, and where even the locals don't know how to receive them. Unlike other European countries, Sweden gives citizenship without language tests, without needing a job, and without seriously checking criminal records. You only need to be physically present in the country for a certain amount of time. From day one, an immigrant has access to subsidized housing, free healthcare, education, unemployment benefits, and paid training courses. And slowly, those same systems that once helped Swedes ended up becoming an invisible trap for immigrants because they held them back. A clear example is the case of Iranian immigrants who came to Sweden during the 1980s and 1990s to escape the Islamic regime. Many of them were highly educated, middle class, and had professional experience. But once in Sweden, only 18% managed to join the workforce, and on average they earned 35% less than Swedes. In the United States, Iranian immigrants with similar backgrounds during the same period not only integrated, they earned on average 36% more than native-born Americans. The difference wasn't in the immigrants, it was in the system that received them. In Sweden, more than 60% of jobs are found through informal contacts, friends, family, or former classmates. But new arrivals don't have those networks. And without the language, without references, and without social ties, the door to employment is shut. As a result, today, half of all non-Western immigrants in Sweden are unemployed. And among those who do have jobs, many work off and on with low pay and no real chance of moving up. On top of that, they receive up to 9 times more in government benefits than native Swedes. It's not because they don't want to work, it's because the system failed to demand what was needed for them to fully integrate. Instead of pushing people toward independence, the Swedish model kept them stuck, creating an environment where you didn't need to integrate to survive. Immigrants lost the motivation to learn the language, the urgency to find work, and even the need to understand the unspoken rules of society. What started as protection became exclusion, and the Swedish society split in two. There are entire neighborhoods where native Swedes are almost non-existent, where Swedish is no longer the main language, and where social norms are governed by their own separate codes. These are the so-called utsatta områden, or vulnerable areas. They include neighborhoods like Rinkeby in Stockholm, Rosengård in Malmö, or Angered in Gothenburg, where social exclusion, unemployment, and low education levels mix with a growing presence of organized crime and rejection of authority. At the beginning of the 2010s, there were just over a dozen such areas. But year after year, the list grew. By 2015, there were 55. And in the official 2023 report, the number reached 59, with 17 of them classified as especially vulnerable. That year, around 550,000 people, about 5% of the population, were living in one of these areas. There are neighborhoods where public services work only part of the time, where police face serious challenges to operate, and where the law is replaced by intimidation and the informal power of criminal gangs. The most worrying part isn't just that these areas exist, it's that they persist. In many cases, these are the same neighborhoods listed in the first reports over a decade ago. They haven't disappeared. On the contrary, they've become entrenched as parallel enclaves within the Swedish state. This was a direct result of a model that failed to integrate anyone. A clear example is the school system, which wasn't built to handle such wide diversity. The Swedish principle of educational equality stopped working when students who spoke fluent Swedish were placed in the same classrooms as others who didn't speak it at all. The official solution was to keep them together, hoping that sharing the space would lead to inclusion. But in practice, that mix didn't raise standards, it lowered them. The results are worrying. Sweden, which used to rank among the top in international assessments, has seen a steady decline in performance. In the 2022 PISA report, 25% of 15-year-old students in Sweden failed to reach the basic level of math skills, and around 24% didn't reach that level in reading comprehension either. Public schools in vulnerable areas are not only failing to integrate, they're failing to teach. And that has long-term consequences. Because if the first generation of immigrants came with hope and gratitude, the second has grown up with frustration, exclusion, and resentment. And so, the country that once imagined itself as a big family ended up divided into two separate societies that no longer connect. One that still works, with stable jobs, strong institutions, and trust in the future. And another that survives on the margins, caught between reliance on welfare benefits, precarious work, and exclusion. For a long time, Sweden's political leaders talked about challenges, isolated problems, and ongoing processes. They avoided using words like crisis or violence. But starting in 2015, the problem of violence can no longer be hidden. What began as small pockets of crime in poor neighborhoods turned into a structural network of organized crime, with national reach, territorial control, and connections inside the state itself. Today, Sweden is no longer compared with its Nordic neighbors, but with countries in the developing world. In 2022, the rate of gun homicides in Stockholm was about 30 times higher than in London when adjusted per capita. And the use of automatic weapons and public executions has become a regular feature in the news. Hand grenades have been used in dozens of attacks in urban areas. Seems more like a war zone than a Scandinavian democracy. Gangs are recruiting teenagers, even minors, who live in segregated neighborhoods with no role models, no expectations, and no ties to the rest of society. These young people are easily recruited by criminal networks that offer them status, money, and a sense of belonging, in exchange for working as soldiers, messengers, lookouts, or hitmen. According to an official statement published by the Swedish government, the total criminal economy generates between 100 and 150 billion Swedish kronor per year. This equates to roughly 9 to 13.5 billion US dollars annually. But the most alarming thing is that violence is no longer limited to the streets. because organized crime in Sweden has entered the state. Criminal networks have learned how to exploit the Swedish welfare system, the same system that was designed to help the most vulnerable. They forge documents, create fake identities, set up fake companies, manipulate attendance records, and fraudulently access social benefits. The goal is no longer just to control territory, it's also to capture public resources. This means that crime in Sweden no longer survives against the system. Now it survives off the system. That's why the impact isn't just economic, it also breaks people's trust in the state, the very pillar that supported Swedish society for decades. But violence is not only the fault of those who commit it, it's also the fault of those who allowed it to grow. Because crime didn't appear overnight, it was the logical result of decades of exclusion and failed policies. And above all, silence. In a modern democracy, problems aren't solved by ignoring them, but that's exactly what Sweden did for more than a decade. From the mid-2000s to the late 2010s, the Swedish state stopped publishing data on the link between crime and ethnic background. For 15 years, the size of the problem was hidden by political choice. The official argument was that publishing this data could fuel stigma, increase xenophobia, and give ammunition to the far right. But in practice, what it did was block any honest diagnosis of what was happening. Researchers couldn't access the data, journalists avoided the topic, and traditional political parties preferred to look the other way. And any citizen who tried to talk about it was quickly discredited. Talking about crime and immigration, even with data, without prejudice, and with good intentions, became a total taboo. Ordinary people, especially those living in affected neighborhoods, knew what was happening, but they didn't feel allowed to say it. The fear wasn't of violence, it was of being labeled a racist. Meanwhile, the political, media, and academic elites lived in safe, well-funded, and culturally homogenous neighborhoods, from where they dictated the country's moral standards. The result was a deep fracture in public debate. Sweden became divided between those who lived the problem and couldn't speak about it, and those who talked a lot but didn't live it. That prolonged silence, combined with the feeling that the elites weren't listening, didn't understand, or were simply denying reality, couldn't last forever. So, in the middle of that official silence, a new voice appeared. A voice that didn't promise integration or unity, but order, control, and clearer borders. For many people, it was the first time in years that someone said what they were experiencing, and that frustration would find an outlet at the ballot box. In the 2018 elections, the Sweden Democrats, a nationalist, openly anti-immigration party, won 17.5% of the national vote, becoming the third largest party in parliament. 4 years later, in the 2022 elections, their support grew to 20.5%, making them the second most voted party. What stood out wasn't just the number of votes, but who voted for them. It wasn't old men from rural areas. A significant portion of the vote came from young people born and raised in Sweden, many of them educated in public schools that actively promoted the values of multiculturalism. Kids who were told they lived in an equal society, that diversity was a strength, and that any difficulty they faced was just a prejudice to overcome. But whose daily experience was very different, with divided classrooms, constant conflict, unprepared teachers, and a system that asked them to adapt without offering answers. But they weren't the only ones. Sweden's political shift cut across generations, genders, social classes, and regions. What used to be marginal became mainstream. Because the Swedish model didn't fail overnight, it failed slowly, in front of millions of citizens who watched it fall apart in their daily lives. This political shift has now turned into concrete new policies, such as tightening the requirements to receive government benefits, making it mandatory for immigrant children to attend preschool, and drastically reducing net immigration. In fact, in 2023, net immigration was just 30,000 people, one of the lowest levels in decades. For the first time in a long time, the Swedish state has stopped assuming that integration happens automatically and is now demanding active adaptation. Political correctness no longer controls the public agenda like before. The media now talks about shootings, politicians acknowledge the existence of ghettos, and the words that once couldn't be spoken are now part of official discourse. But even so, repairing the damage will take time. You can't undo an entire generation that grew up excluded and without a sense of belonging, and you can't rebuild overnight the trust that once held the Swedish model together. Cities remain divided, schools remain segregated, politics remains polarized. A society isn't held together by only laws and subsidies, but by something much more fragile, the sense of belonging. And when that invisible bond breaks, it doesn't matter how rich a country is, how efficient its institutions are, or how generous its intentions may be. The dream of the folkhemmet, of a shared home, can turn into a place full of strangers. That's the end of today's video. If you liked it, don't forget to check out the next one.